cow that lost more than half a point of body condition had a 5 times greater odds of having a pregnancy loss event.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. My name is Reagan Bluel, and I'm with the University of Missouri Dairy Team, and our guest today comes to us from the Worcester Research Campus at Ohio State University. Dr. Krogstad joined OSU Dairy faculty last year after graduating from Michigan State, so it makes sense that the work that we're highlighting today was co-authored with Dr. Bradford, also of Michigan State. So the highlighted project this month is going to help us better understand the true production cost of body condition score change during that transition window from late gestation into early lactation. There were over 800 cows that were enrolled in a study titled The Association of Body Condition Score Change, Hyperketonemia with Mastitis, Reproduction, and Milk Production. So let's just say these are three really critical interrelated topics for a successful dairy farm. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this data that published just this month, and hold tight because you're going to need to grab a pen. There's a lot of associations. We're going to quantify a lot of different numbers to help us understand that true cost of hyperketonemia. But before we do that, Dr. Krogstad, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for having me, Reagan. I've been a listener in the past, and I appreciate you inviting me to join you. So my background, I grew up on a dairy farm. My dad milked 350 cows until 2019, and then my stepdad and his family, they still milk cows. They milk about 1,800 cows near Rochester, Minnesota. So I am innately aware of the dairy cow world, and it's kind of part of my DNA. And I guess my only problem was I like to golf too much, is what my dad told me. So I went into academia and did education at Nebraska and Michigan State, and now I do dairy nutrition research largely, but I focus on dairy nutrition health and how nutrition can also affect sustainability. But my role here is research extension. So I really work on finding ways to use research and use some extension programming to help producers implement the data that we uncover and some of the tools that we try to build.
Awesome. So let's just take a few seconds to kind of speed through the basics real quick to make sure everyone's on the same page on terminology. So hyperketonemia, if you slow that down, is really just three Latin words smushed together. And if we pull those apart and translate it, hyper means too much. Keto means ketones, and we've probably all heard of ketones. And then emia is in the blood. So you've just got too much of these ketones in the blood. When did you collect those samples? And is it appropriate to call it ketosis?
Yeah, so the samples were collected the first week of lactation between 3 and 7 days in milk. And I suppose a little bit of context, or some additional context for this data set, is this is one dairy farm in Michigan. So it's a very specific set of circumstances. And the farm staff does routine hyperketonemia monitoring on multiparous cows, so second, third, fourth lactation and up. And they do that during the first week of lactation. And so that's what we did here. So the idea of whether it's ketosis or hyperketonemia, I struggle getting it right, but hyperketonemia is more correct because we're just looking at that elevated level of those ketones in blood. But I think it's important to understand too, is we were only looking at associations as we dive into this data. None of this is treatments that we applied. We were just observing these cows.
So you're going to make me say hyperketonemia every time, and it's a mouthful, and that's fine. I'll do that for all the listeners. Because it is more appropriate. But what we're really measuring is the beta hydroxybutyrates, right? And and in order to get those beta hydroxybutyrates in the blood, we're having some lipolysis, so that body condition score is being mobilized. She's thinning down a little bit, and she's converting it to energy to support lactation. So tell me a little bit about what you saw in those beta hydroxybutyrates in the second and third parity cattle.
Yeah, certainly. So the cutoff we used for hyperketonemia was 1.2 millimoles per liter, which is the kind of the standard metric in the dairy industry. And we didn't distinguish between clinical or subclinical. So clinical being those cows that are visibly off feed and down in milk and those kinds of things. These were subclinical cows. We didn't distinguish between those two groups. So I want to start there. But as we looked at these cows that had the elevated ketones in their blood, 12% of second parity cows on this particular dairy had what we classified as hyperketonemia, and 23% of those third parity and greater cows had what we would classify as hyperketonemia, which falls right in line with prevalence from a lot of projects. So nothing here is super outlandish. But what was most intriguing to me was how penal it was to have hyperketonemia in our older cows.
Yeah.
So in second lactation cows, I think it was, fairly similar production in that mid to low 40 kilograms a day, which comes out to about 90 pounds of milk. That third parity group was a 5 kilogram penalty, basically, for the hyperketonemia incidence. And so it's much more substantial than we were expecting, but quite an interesting finding in this study.
Well, and we do have listeners across the world, but let's put that in pounds of milk, guys. That's a nearly 12 pounds of milk for those mature cows. And so I do think that a reoccurring theme that you'll hear come up over and over in this data set is those mature cows. And looking at the mature cows and the culling side of things and the fertility side of things, there's just a lot going on there. And so keep that in mind with your 3+ lactations. Can we just pause for just a second? I really want to pay a compliment to the two authors here. This is such a beautifully written discussion in this paper. It really does a fabulous job reviewing the literature of what we've come to know up to this point about energy partitioning for that milk cow. And for years and years and years, we've understood that those fat cows, they fail through transition. But I really do applaud you guys for taking the time to take this data set. And I know it was just one herd, but don't minimize it. This data set possesses the ability to really kind of encapsulate some interesting associations. And so before we really peel down into your data set to better understand that most ideal body condition score, because I want to assure you it's super tempting to just, here we are 3 minutes into the podcast, ask you, hey, have we gotten this body condition score thing wrong all this time? But I'm not going to do that just yet. I really want to emphasize to those listeners, if you have a moment, there's a clickable link to this paper, open access paper at the bottom of the show notes, where you can check this out and take the time to go to a printer, but print it in color. Because what he's talking about there, that most recent discussion, was figure 3. And looking at that pre-body condition score. And if you really take a minute and look at that, you see these waves of, you've got your first lactation animals that's got more of a flat lactation curve, into your second lactation that's really showing that peak milk yield. And then those mature cows are just cranking in milk yield on kilograms per day. And you can see the visual differences between the 3.75 and 3.25. And if you just look at it graphically, it almost looks like from this moment on, we have to, as dairy specialists, change our recommendations. All of a sudden, it looks like we need to be maybe suggesting that a higher body condition score in that transition is the case. Could you talk a little bit about what we know or don't know and how that figure might be misleading us?
Yeah, so there's some caveats in our data. And one of those is that we don't have many cows at the far end on the high spectrum. And so within that discussion, which I really appreciate the kind comments, and I'd give a lot of credit to Dr. Bradford for his nuanced mentorship and understanding this, in that we didn't have many cows above 3.5. And we discussed that in the paper, which is, I think we only had 30 cows that in this whole data set were over a 3.5 body condition prepartum. And those were largely older cows.
Out of 956. So let's pause. This is just a really well-managed herd, right?
Yeah, they do a good job. And what we had was, like, in the beginning of the project, we had a slug of big cows that came through kind of all together. And this herd was actively working on mitigating that because they knew it was a challenge. So the way that I've looked at this data, because initially I did the same thing you did, I'm like, oh my gosh, have we been thinking of this wrong? But sometimes in these papers and projects, you do have some little anomalies that pop up. And I think when you really look at this, you'll see that we just don't have enough data at that far end of the spectrum to really say, oh, you need these bigger cows. But I do think that moderate range of 3.25 to 3.5, there's a really strong case to be made for that window in the prepartum, and a really strong case to be made for stability in that body condition, which we'll dig into more.
Absolutely. Very good. Well, and I love the discussion. And you had kind of said back in your history, as far as it's okay, you put that condition on and you see them turn it into milk. And I hear the comment said often in the barns, we don't mind seeing the girls in their working clothes, right?
Hmm.
And so and those thin cows. But let's transition and talk a little bit about how that loss of body condition score is related to reproduction. And let's talk about the inflammation side of things that might be happening and correlating back to reproduction. So tell us what you learned in this data set, specifically on pregnancy losses.
Yeah, so actually the main reason we did this paper is we wanted to dig in where there's a group and a professor at Michigan State, Dr. Richard Pursley, who's spending a lot of energy trying to understand fertility dynamics, especially why cows lose pregnancy. And what we dug into is there's really not much. There's 2 or 3 data points out there that looked at pregnancy loss with body condition or hyperketonemia. So what we looked at was our definition of pregnancy loss in this case is a cow that she confirmed pregnant at that 30-day check, ultrasound, looked good. The vet said, yep, she's pregnant. Come back at 60-day check and she's open. Those were the cows we're worried about. And this is where the level of body condition prepartum and some of the body condition change dynamics really showed up. And so what we saw is that cows with a greater body condition prepartum, but there's a linear increase. Basically, as you go from low to high, there's a pretty steady increase in the odds that those cows are going to have pregnancy loss. And also the cows that lost body condition, and this was one of our large magnitude effects, was that a cow that lost more than half a point of body condition had a 5 times greater odds of having a pregnancy loss event.
That's awesome.
Which,
I mean,
yeah,
not
and
awesome,
it's substantial, right?
but
Yeah,
but
right.
real,
Not
not
terrible.
awesome, but really cool that you guys were able to capture that. I mean, that's
Yeah, it was a neat effect.
very much so. And so that change is quantifiable. And what do you think is happening? Why do you think that is being observed?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of compelling biology around that potential question. I think the easy one and sort of a Murphy's Law, right? The easy answer is the right answer is those cows that are losing a lot of body condition are the ones who had the most negative energy balance, and that's usually associated with poorer fertility. So that is part of it. If there's just less energy for that cow to hold on to that pregnancy, greater odds she's going to have difficulties holding on to it. There could be a story with the hyperketonemia playing into that, and because we have evidence that elevated fatty acids in blood and elevated ketone bodies in blood make it harder for cows to maintain a pregnancy. And they do these kind of projects in petri dishes. And so they found that the egg and the blastocyst are more poorly developed in those cases. And the inflammation could be part of it as well, where if these cows have an inflamed state, then perhaps the reproductive tract it's not in a status to hold on to those pregnancies very well. Big picture, those are the things I think about. But I think the easiest one is these cows are just not ready yet.
Sure.
They're too negative of energy balance. They're still putting that body condition back on. The signals in their body are telling their reproductive tract to just hold on a minute, we're not ready.
Yeah.
And so I think that's maybe what's happening with these cows that are losing half a point, 3/4 of a point through that calving period.
Yeah, the environment there is just too hostile. And
Right.
it's just not conducive to maintaining that pregnancy. And so I appreciate you kind of going through and interjecting the literature review as you go through, because frankly, there's probably less than 10 people in this entire nation that is as read as you and your co-author on this topic. And so I just love the opportunity to pick your brain with this podcast. It's so fun to hang out with fellow animal scientists and geek out on some transition cow information. All right, let's talk about mastitis and specifically some of the odds ratio of how does this hyperketonemia impact the rate of mastitis, both in the first case and overall.
Yeah, so I think we have a dogma and an idea in dairy management that these fat cows and these cows that have the elevated ketones, that they're the ones that get disease. And we wanted to look at that on another data set. And there is some data out there, but it's a little bit wishy-washy sometimes. And so, body condition, largely, we did not see that to be related to disease prevalence or mastitis prevalence in these cows. But the cows with hyperketonemia had about a 35% increase in odds of getting mastitis. And there is a really clear biological explanation for that. And this is one I like to hit on heavily because I think in the industry we have this argument between like two camps is are these elevated ketones and hyperketonemia, are they bad? Is it good? Is it natural?
Right.
Is it a problem? And I love getting into it because people have strong passions about
For
it.
sure.
And so in the immune system, when BHB is elevated, for example, BHB binds to a very specific receptor on a cell.
Mhm.
And when it binds to that receptor, it actually suppresses a host of these immune functions that help fight off pathogens or help fight off disease.
Cool.
That can be good in some contexts, but it can be bad in others.
Mhm.
So it's not like saying every cow that gets hyperketonemia gets mastitis. We're not saying that, right? We're saying there's a 35% increase in odds. So there's just greater risk. It's like buying a risky stock versus
Mhm.
buying a not risky stock.
Mhm.
One might gain more, but it also has the odds of losing more.
Correct.
So that's something that's important to point out that the biology is very clear on how that can happen.
Mhm.
So that when cows have this elevated ketone level, some of the immune system functions might be challenged or suppressed, is
Mhm.
one way to describe it. Maybe not totally correct, but that biological effect might lead them to be more exposed to mastitis. Or if there are pathogens around, they might have just a little less defense than their healthy or non-hyperketonemia herd mates.
Mhm. Interesting. And there was also an effect again here, your mature cows, that 3+ lactation had the highest prevalence, correct?
Of mastitis,
Mhm.
yes.
And the
Yep.
greatest limitation of that immune function. Potentially, yeah. And so
Right.
I do think it's interesting, when we look at the chart here on figure 5, looking at the health status of healthy animals versus hyperketonemia animals, and there's clearly a milk yield difference. And specifically, again, on those aged cows, could you talk a little bit about, is this just the effect? Are we just looking at the mastitis effect here?
That's an interesting question, and I don't have any certain way to answer that. It could be. There could be just a general health effect that those cows that are third parity plus that had hyperketonemia had more problems across the board and they just made less milk. I'm less inclined to say that. I think that those cows that have the elevated hyper or the elevated ketones, the hyperketonemia, those cows just their metabolism isn't functioning in the same manner. And so there could be other things that are reducing their ability to put milk in the tank.
Mm-hmm.
It could be general health, but I have no way to tell you for certain.
Sure.
But I think this finding being as substantial as it is, or as clear as it is with that 12-pound difference, as you say,
For sure.
definitely has me thinking about what impacts we have in those older cows, especially as our dairy herd productive life gets a little bit longer and a little bit.
Well, and I applaud you guys for, again, taking time to look at this data set, because a lot of that data that we initially started looking at the transition cow with, it's starting to age a little bit, right? And our modern dairy cow, through genetics, genomics, and breeding, just we've really changed. We've moved the mark. Here you're talking about how this herd is averaging over 90 pounds of milk every day being milked by robots. We need to better understand her metabolism. And a quote in your paper, perhaps healthy lipolysis, where this hyperketonemia is avoided, is positive for milk production, but when healthy lipolysis is disrupted. So it's in quotes, healthy lipolysis. And I think it's tricky because that's what's so valuable about managers who understand the cow, that can go out into the barn and differentiate between we're about ready to hit a train wreck versus we're riding that healthy risk, or we're riding that line of right and wrong. So could you talk a little bit about when they tested from 3 to 7, and if they found that they were above that 1.2 threshold, did they treat or did they not, and how did they treat?
Yeah, so excellent question, because that is one of the big things to highlight here. So we tested for the ketone level in blood in that first week after calving, between 3 and 7 days in milk. And that is the time to investigate this. So if there are producers that are looking at implementing a monitoring program or already have one in place, the monitoring should occur the first week of lactation, because that is when hyperketonemia has the most substantial negative effects on our cows. And that's shown time and again. And then there's an excellent review by Dr. McCart out of Cornell and her colleague Sabine Mann And they highlight that as well, and that we should be monitoring in that first week, because hyperketonemia in that first week reduces milk yield. It's associated with poorer health and poorer reproduction. But if we have hyperketonemia in week 2, those differences are not associated with much of anything, and maybe associated with a slight increase in milk yield. And that's where this conversation gets nuanced. So that timing is part of it. And I appreciate you pulling that quote out. That was probably my favorite sentence to write in my entire PhD program. Because I love the nuance there. It's not just lipolysis equals hyperketonemia. Because when we looked in this data set, the level of body condition loss was not associated with hyperketonemia. It was not associated with BHB. That surprised us, but it's important to remember that when those free fatty acids get mobilized, they can be completely oxidized and used as fuel, or partially oxidized to create those ketones. And so that's why I put the healthy lipolysis in there, because there is a degree that there's a small population of cows in here that they would have lost a half a point of body condition, but they had tremendously low blood ketones.
Yeah, they're just doing it.
Right, and that's a population.
We gotta figure her out.
We don't understand those cows. They're just rocking
yes,
and rolling.
I love that cow. We all know who that cow is, or actually maybe we don't, because she's no problem and she breeds back and she does exactly what she's supposed to do. If only we could like replicate her over and over and over again.
Yeah, just bottle her. I always call that the invisible cow, and I tell my students and I tell producers, like my research program, my goal is to create more invisible cows.
Love
They're
that.
ones you only see them at calving, breeding, and dry off. You don't see them any other time.
Love that.
And that's what that healthy lipolysis cow is. So I think it's a neat population to ponder or think about.
Oh man, that's good stuff. Honestly, I think we could stop the podcast right here, right now. I'm like, mic drop, boom, the invisible cow. So let's circle back to the question there. Did they get treated with propylene glycol after they were identified?
Yes, yeah. So the treatment protocol for this herd was propylene glycol drench for a few days, depending on the level of hyperketonemia. And so I can't tell you whether that was an impactful treatment, because they gave it to all cows with it. So it wasn't something we tested in the study, but that was their treatment protocol, which is a fairly by the book approach.
For sure. We've had some discussion about inflammation and immune system. What about the literature, and what does it say about potentially giving something to block that inflammation response?
Right. I think that's another one with a great deal of nuance, is that suppressing that inflammation to a degree might be helpful, because we know cows that have elevated inflammatory markers in blood make less milk, get pregnant less often, and all those things. But it's a required response around that calving window. Those cows will experience some degree of an inflammatory response. They're expelling the placenta, they're healing their uterus, the mammary gland is undergoing change. Inflammation is not just a bad thing. It's also driving these physiological changes that allow that cow to adapt to lactation. It's not necessary to try to block all of that, but if we manage these cows well and just give them opportunities to adjust, their bodies will handle most all of it on their own.
Isn't she just an amazing beast?
She is.
My mind keeps going back to what you were saying, and maybe there's no more to expand on it, but the healthy lipolysis during the first week, and going back to that data set out of Cornell from last year, do you want to expand at all? What's happening? Why is it just that first week an elevated hyperketonemia? Why is that okay?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember, especially when I was looking at the data kind of cow by cow, day by day, is these animals are not really taking off that first 2, 3, 4 days, right? They're still driving, their intake is still creeping up a little bit. Their milk yield is slowly climbing. And then all of a sudden she's going to take off. Well, it's going to be a little bit of a delay between when she takes off and when we see that increase in these ketones. And so that's, I think, the first thing to recognize is that cows that might have higher ketones later in lactation, those are the ones they're cranking, making a lot of milk, they're eating as much feed as they can. That may not be a problem. Those cows that have the ketones in that first week when milk yield is not yet really high might have something that their intake may be an issue there, or the ketones could be elevated because that is part of their general inflammatory response. Because I think something that we've begun to learn is that hyperketonemia and generalized systemic inflammation to a degree are linked. They're interlinked, because the tissue is changing, the adipose tissue is changing, her whole body is changing. And those two things are always going to be slightly interlinked.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to get rid of one completely without the other. So that may be part of it, is perhaps she had an elevated inflammatory status, and the elevation in blood ketones is just an artifact of that. So those things can be interlinked, and that may be why ketosis in that first week is so associated with bad outcomes compared to a hyperketonemia in the second.
And sometimes I forget that fat cell is constantly changing, right? I
Right.
mean, when you think about fat, it just seems like it's so solidified. It's just there. It's present. It's not, but it's active. It's changing. It's just like every cell in the body is constantly evolving and changing, and this is no different. Interesting. All right, so we have to talk a little bit about culling and how this hyperketonemia is impacting the cull rate. So let's talk about that for a moment. What did you find in the data? What kind of associations?
Yeah, so to begin with the hyperketonemia, we actually saw a fairly marked substantial increase in the odds of those cows leaving the herd. Cows that had hyperketonemia were more than twice as likely to be culled during that lactation. Another way to frame that is that every 1 unit increase in BHB was associated with about a 70% increase in their odds of leaving the herd. So
Wow,
it seemed fairly
that's huge.
substantial.
Hold on. So just 1 unit increased by 70%. That's huge.
Yeah, so I mean, it's another reason to think about how we're managing those cows to mitigate some of these excesses.
And so, of course, this hyperketonemia is a direct result of body condition score change. But what did the data tell you about body condition score and culling?
So it was fairly nuanced, and it has some different outcomes based on the prepartum, postpartum, and change. So like prepartum cows, the thinner cows prepartum are the ones that have the greater likelihood of leaving. And I think there's some intuitiveness to that, as those cows that are very skinny in the prepartum period, there might be something else wrong with them. Or perhaps they had issues at the end of lactation that they're not going to have much luck getting through the transition. So we also want to avoid those very thin cows prepartum. But the postpartum and body condition score change, what was interesting. The cows that lost body condition, the more they lost, the more likely they were to leave the herd. It was an 80% increase in their odds ratio of experiencing culling if they lost more body condition. And when we talk about just postpartum BCS, those thin cows were at twice greater odds of leaving the herd. And so monitoring that body condition is still fairly important. And it's something where I often come back to an idea of stable body condition, because those cows seem to be at just lower risk across the board, lower risk for mastitis, lower risk for ketosis and hyperketonemia, lower risk for culling and production losses. And so this culling data really drives home the point that animals that experience a great deal of fluctuation in their body condition and in their metabolic status might be the ones that are going to eventually experience greater challenges and maybe not get pregnant and then get cold, or maybe have mastitis and then get cold, or maybe even have lameness and then get cold. So it's something to really keep in mind, is we want to keep that animal in a nice narrow window of body condition as often as we can.
This is just one herd's prevalence of hyperketonemia, but what's the prevalence of this disease in dairy cattle for America?
Yeah, excellent question. And it's a range based on the literature, based on what we have seen published, of like 10 to 30%. And it increases with increasing parity across a whole host of data. So based on this project and some of the other data out there, I would say your second lactation cows, it's going to be somewhere in that 10 to 15% range. And I would say it's reasonable to have a goal of being less than 10% prevalence in that population. And in your third plus, it could be 20 to 30%, but we maybe want to be aiming for less than 20 as some reasonable benchmarks.
So I try really hard on this podcast to focus in on one particular paper, and that's what we've been talking about here. But I have to bring up to the point that this data set generated because you were also looking at niacin. And so would you like to give a brief discussion on did it work? Is niacin helpful in helping that transition cow and kind of smoothing out the edges?
Yeah, well, thanks for the chance to plug some of that work. We did do a project where we provided rumen-protected niacin to cows after calving. And what we saw there is that the providing of rumen-protected niacin increased peak milk yield by a couple pounds a day. and which resulted in about 1,300, 1,400 pounds of milk over the course of lactation for first and second parity cows. So there is potential for rumen-protected niacin to be a tool for producers to use in that window of time. We definitely have more we want to learn about that particular compound and some of the biology surrounding it, but it seemed the data seemed promising for us, and we're really excited about it.
Well, and I appreciate you mentioned that, but here we didn't talk about that 3+ lactation, that parity, that mature cow. So really focused in on that first and second lactation then.
Right. The amount of nuance we've introduced into this podcast may be difficult to implement some changes.
I think everybody that's listening to this, the wheels in their brain is just turning and smoking and trying to figure it all out, right?
Well, I know mine was when I was writing this associations paper. It certainly got me thinking, and I think it changed some of the ways that I think about how that cow's going to change over the course of her lactation. But what it really drove home for me is if we can reduce those excesses. There is some lipolysis that'll happen. That's fine. We just want to reduce the excess. So there's some elevation in ketones that'll occur. That's all right. We just have to make sure to reduce the excess. And that realization that those cows they're going to go through some changes. We just have to keep guardrails up for them. Really helps me think about how to manage them through that difficult period.
Okay, so the conventional body condition score recommendations as a dairy specialist, are they the same as what they've been for all these years?
Well, I will first admit my own bias. I've always liked a little bit of a heavier cow, but my recommendation is prepartum 3.25 is my average, my mean goal, and that 3.25 to 3.5 window. And I'd like to maintain that or lose a quarter point through the transition window. And hopefully she's stable through the rest of lactation. One thing that I do not want to have happen is I don't want her to gain body condition in the dry period. I want her to have the condition she needs by the time lactation is wrapped up. And then I want that condition to be stable through the dry period. I think that's where you get these so-called train wrecks, is the cows that maybe put on a quarter or half a point after they've dried off, or because they got pregnant too late and their lactation ran long or something like that. So I think stable body condition is the goal.
Name of the game. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, my favorite question to always ask is, what out of all of this, is there one particular thing that you really want to drive home to those boots on the ground dairymen?
Yeah, I think my big takeaway would be sort of what I just outlined, is that find your targeted body condition that you're comfortable with on your cows, and just try to hold that, keep it steady. I think anywhere in that 3 to 3.5 range, if you can maintain a cow in that window for her whole lactation and dry period, she's probably going to be one of those invisible cows that you're not worried about and that just gets pregnant on time and pays the bills.
Awesome. Well, Kirby, this has been a great discussion. I really want to thank you for your time. Listeners, I appreciate your time and applaud you for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the nuances and associations with that transition dairy cow. I've enjoyed our conversation, and this has been the January edition of the Dairy Science Digest, a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles and press because it's sound science that you can base your management decisions around, and it's provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team. So be sure to like, share, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Bluel with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a great day.